Huh?
Did I see your husband? Was the panels here?
Yeah.
Okay, this is still August 29th, 1997. We're in Columbus, Ohio, and this is Victoria Ekegren interviewing, and I'm here with Fred Stillman from the 494th.
495th.
Fifth. Wow. Okay, why don't you start telling me, where were you born?
I was born in Dumont, New Jersey, January 16th, 1922.
A Capricorn. Wow.
Yes, I am.
Tell me about your dad.
My dad grew up in Brooklyn, New York. He left his home, he finished his education at the 8th grade because he had to go and support his family. He worked in a bank in New York City by the name of the Empire Trust Company. Worked there for 45 years and retired. He passed away in 1963.
What are some things that you learned from your dad?
Well, I learned things like compassion, understanding the value of $1, and what a good family life is being.
How did the Depression years affect you?
I was not too aware of the Depression years growing up because of the security of the family. I do recall just prior to the Depression there was a big boom in New York City on Wall Street, and the Christmas before the Depression actually began, I was flooded with gifts. I was an only child, so spoiled to some degree. But the Depression itself, I was young enough not to appreciate some of the things that were happening to families. I always felt secure where I was, didn't have a lot during that period of time, but it was a very happy time of my life.
Tell me about your schooling. How far did you?
All right. I lived in a small town in Long Island by the name of Seacliff. It was 1 square mile. The school there was Seacliff Elementary School and Seacliff High School. In those days, it was a very small community, mostly farming in the surrounding areas. And it wasn't until after World War II it changed drastically. But at that time, it was a quiet, small community. I started a school in Seacliff, the Seacliff school system, and I went all the way through that school district. My graduating class had 54 people in it. I did fairly well in school. I was president of the student body, and I was captain of the basketball team and captain of the track team, and life in general was great. It wasn't until after the war that I had the opportunity to go to college, because right after I graduated from high school, I was drafted into the Army. After the war was finished, I started my college education at Adelphi University, which was a girls' school prior to World War II. Following the war, it became coeducational. I went there 1 year and left because I married my wife. We were looking for some place to live. So where did we settle? We settled in Wichita, Kansas. Why did we settle there? Because we were interested in some institution which we could afford. We didn't have a lot of money, and I was going on the GI Bill, and some place where we could live. The background there is during the war, many of the farmers came off the farms in Kansas to work in the aircraft industry in Wichita. There were 3 large aircraft factories there: Boeing, Beech, and Cessna. The government had to build a temporary city, virtually, to accommodate all the farmers. The housing there was in a community called Plainview, and they built these 2-story Army barracks and divided them off into 6 apartments. After the war was over, the farmers virtually deserted the place and went back to the farm. So the government made an arrangement with the University of Wichita that if they would house veterans coming back from the war and who were attending the university there, that they would do so at reasonable rates. Reasonable rates where we had a 3-bedroom apartment, a living room, dining room, kitchen. All the bills were paid: electricity, water, fuel. Everything was paid for, and the rent was $25 a month. That was exactly what I could afford. Our subsistence pay was $125. I finished college in 3 years, graduating from the University of Wichita in 1949, with a major in both history and economics.
How did Pearl Harbor affect your life?
The only way Pearl Harbor directly affected my life was an awakening of something horrible that was happening in a basically tranquil world that I was living in at the time. I didn't realize that I remember very well the day that this happened, and President Roosevelt came on the radio and announced that Pearl Harbor had been attacked by the Japanese. And I thought to myself, what does this mean? How is it going to affect me? I was just out of high school at that time. But soon after that, I realized it was much more, and it was going to affect my life at some point in the future, and of course it did.
When did you get drafted into the war?
I was drafted in October of 1942, and went to Camp Campbell directly, and then all with the 12th Armored Division from that time until the war ended.
When did you marry your wife?
I married my wife in 1947, July 11th, 1947, and she went to school with me. We grew up together.
Tell me about Camp Campbell. What are some first impressions that you have?
Well, this was the first time in my life that I had been away from home. The farthest I had ever traveled at that point was to New Jersey. I'd never been out of New York or New Jersey. So it was some degree of excitement, of course, leaving home. I went to Camp Upton on Long Island, and from there put on a train, and I was announced that I was going to the Armored Corps in Camp Campbell, Kentucky. I had no idea what that meant, of course, and the excitement of being on the train with hundreds and hundreds of other boys in the same situation as I was a degree of excitement too. So when we arrived at Camp Campbell, which was virtually a flat mud plain, is the way I looked at it, with the housing on it. It was a barren existence, but nevertheless, it was still an exciting change in my life, and I for some reason, I guess I was really looking forward to it. And of course, as soon as we got into the barracks, and then we started getting into the routine, I became accustomed, of course, to that lifestyle. And but again, it was an exciting adventure for me at that time.
Who are some friends that you remember? Who would be your best
Well,
friend?
my first friends that I made there was a fellow by the name of Jerry Hoadley, who was only there for some 6 or 8 months before he left the Air Corps, and I hadn't seen him until today. And he came to his first reunion, and we had another reunion of seeing each other after all that period of time. The interesting thing about Jerry was that even though he was just a brief time there, he left the 12th Armored Division to go into the Air Corps after, as I said, about 8 months. But his future wife, then his girlfriend, came to Camp Campbell. They were very much in love, so they decided that they had to get married right away. They wanted to get married. So who did they pick out? I was the best man, and our captain, G.B. Wiley, his wife, Ann Wiley, was the maid of honor at their wedding. And not only was it a reunion for me to see Jerry Hoadley after all these years, but also to see his wife, and Ann Wiley came to this reunion, so we had a reunion of the wedding party. Another friend of mine was Bob Schwartz, who I went through combat with. Some of the other fellows that I was very close to, they passed away. Bob Seymour, Art Backen, and a few others. They have passed away. So the real close friends that I have, they're not with us anymore.
What are some fun times you remember from Camp Campbell?
Oh, I guess the fun times were some of the USO dances that we had on the thing, some of the baseball games. I remember Billy Kahn, who fought Joe Louis in those days. He was part of the 12th Armored Division. I remember some of the boxing matches. Going to the adventures of going to Nashville and Hopkinsville, Kentucky, Nashville, Tennessee, and Clarksville, Tennessee. Those were always fun times on the weekends when you had some time off, and just to go to the movies and walk around town, just get off the base. But it was exciting.
What do you remember about the maneuvers?
The Tennessee maneuvers, I remember them being cold, damp, uncomfortable. One of the other, not close friends, but a friend within my own battery, C battery of the 495th, we had a major accident during the maneuvers where his tank went into I believe the Cumberland River, and he was drowned. So that I remember that vividly, and I remember the long periods of time of just being out there in the cold for the first time, because we had, keep in mind, we had left the base then, and we were living in housing. Now we were sleeping on bedrolls and in the uncomfortable conditions, and that was a real change in life. And that really struck me as a change in our training.
Did you ever worry about the war at this stage?
Of course, yes. We always worried about the war. We worried about where we were eventually going to lead to. During this period of time, there was constant changes in personnel. Some of the fellows were being taken out of the division and sent as replacements overseas. We never knew if that was going to happen to us. We didn't know when they were going to call on us to go overseas. So that was constantly in the back of our minds. And of course, everybody was trying to boost the morale of everyone else and saying, well, it's going to happen, but until it happens, why, we'll just do what we have to do here. But it was in the back of our minds.
What do you remember about leaving the maneuvers?
Well, leaving for maneuvers for us was leaving Camp Campbell and boarding trains, and then going to Camp Barkley and Abilene. We were a little bit surprised about that, because all of us thought at that time that after we finished maneuvers, that would be the time that we would be sent overseas. We didn't know whether it would be to the Pacific or over to Europe, but that's what we were anticipating. So when it was announced that we were going to have further training in Camp Barkley, I suppose in some cases there was great relief that, well, we were just being delayed further, so that delayed the combat years that we were going to have to face. So it was, in some cases, a letdown, in other cases, a relief. But we went to Camp Barkley and settled in there, and things were back to where they were before.
How are things different in Barkley compared to Campbell?
Well, I think one of the things, first of all, by that time, we had enough training to know what was expected of us. Unlike Campbell, where we were going in as raw recruits and we had no idea what was expected of us. So we knew that we had to continue the training and do better at each of our jobs. And of course, the the surrounding terrain was different. In Barclay, why you were in much warmer weather than you were in Campbell. The terrain was different. It was a lot flatter in Barclay, and Campbell had some not mountains, but there were hills there. Excuse me. So the maneuver, we continued to have maneuvers and training and spending long periods of time out in the field when we were in Barclay. But we were really perfecting our skills at that particular time.
What are some practical jokes that you remember? Do you remember any? Practical jokes.
That's a tough question to answer. I'm sure that there were many of them, and I can't think of any that stand out in my mind as a practical joke. What we would play on. I mean, we were always, I suppose, playing jokes on each other, but I can't remember any specific ones, to be truthful with you.
What do you remember about the city of Abilene?
Oh, I remember Abilene was the hot spot to go there, and we used to have the buses. I was just mentioning to some of my friends a little earlier. Do you remember the buses that went from Camp Barclay to Abilene? They were like semi-trailers today, and the trailer part was a long, low-slung, like a boxcar. And when you opened the doors, why everybody walked in, and they had poles in the middle of the buses where you could stand and hang on. It was like riding a subway train in New York, and everybody stood and going into and being trailed in by a little cab. And but Abilene itself, I can remember, they had some USO dances there that were nice, and of course going to the movies, that was a favorite thing for a lot of the fellas to do. And just to get off the base and walk around and talk with people and meet people, go to the stores, have something to eat in the local restaurants. And the people of Abilene, they were very, very gracious, I think, to all of us. And so we really appreciated that, being away from home that way.
Can you just check the audio too? So it's not too loud? I'm scared. When you talk. Okay. Did you have any personal encounters with some people in Abilene? Do you remember any specific situation?
I didn't really. I was probably one of the younger people in my outfit. Some of the older fellas were more forward and ready to be, talk to people and find out where they lived and what was happening in Abilene. When I went there, it was usually with one of my friends or two of my friends, and we, most of the time, we're a little bit bashful and backward about approaching anybody and trying to make friends with them. It was more of a case that we were buddies together, and we would do the things we would do together. The only time that if we wanted to meet some girls or something, we would go to the USO dances, which we did, and they were nice, and that was fun. But as far as meeting any of the families in Abilene, I think married veterans, married soldiers at that time, who were living off the base and were looking for housing in the city of Abilene, they made friends with the people they would live with, or the people who were in the neighborhoods, and more so than what I would have done.
What are some training things? Can you tell me about your training down in Barclay? What are some things that you're...
Well, I remember going out on the reservations and again, sleeping out there. I was recalling one specific incident. There were so many rattlesnakes out on the reservation there. One of the fellows in my section, he caught a king snake, which was a big, long snake. And as a matter of fact, I still have a picture where 5 of us are standing in the picture and we're holding this king snake all at its entire length. He was captured by one of the boys from Tennessee who was a mountain boy, so he was a trapper at heart, so to speak, and he also knew how to handle this kind of a snake. Where he got the food to feed it, I don't know, but he kept this snake in a kind of a very, very large box. And when we went out on maneuvers and we were sleeping out there at nighttime, he would let the snake loose because it would protect us from the rattlesnakes. And in the morning, we would go searching for him, and we would usually find him within the area of 100 yards or so, someplace around, recapture him and put him back in the box. Except one morning, I woke up and I was in my sleeping bag, and I felt something at my feet. And I said, that feels like a snake. And it was a snake, but I didn't know whether it was George, who was the name of the king snake, or was it a rattlesnake. So I was really very, very frightened, actually. So I asked one of my buddies, I said, I have a snake in my sleeping bag. And he said, how do you know it's a snake? I said, I'm sure it is, I can feel it, but I don't know who it is. I said, you better come over and unzip this bag very slowly, which he did. And ultimately we looked down and we could see, and it was our friend George. He was in there with me. So that was a major relief. But one of the things I remember all the armadillos too, hundreds and hundreds of the armadillos. I don't know if they're still there in the area. I suspect that they are. And but also the scrub pine out there. That was something that kind of impressed me. It was really kind of like desert area. But I remember the few of those little incidents.
Are you writing home to your parents? What are you telling your parents?
Oh, I'm telling my parents that I'm fine. A young boy away from home for the first time. You don't want to really say to them, I'm lonely, I miss you, I miss being home, because that would just upset them. And in many ways, I wasn't really that I wasn't lonely or upset. I had my times when I said, boy, I wish I was back home in my own bed, so to speak. But I wrote to my parents quite frequently. I would say 2 or 3 times a week, and just tell them about my friends that I met and some little adventures we might have had, and places we go. We went often to San Angelo. They had a municipal swimming pool there, and 4 of us, whenever we had the opportunity, we'd like to go to San Angelo and get into the pool. That was a big treat for us. Occasionally we went to Fort Worth and Dallas. I remember once I had a 3-day pass, and 4 of us went to Dallas, and we stayed at the Hotel Adolphus, I think is what the name of it is. I think it's still there, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't been in Dallas in years, but that was always a big treat too. But my parents were, I was an only child, so that they were, really always concerned about, am I all right? And so I knew that, and I did try to write to them frequently.
Who are some officers and commanding?
Well, I can remember G.B. Wiley. I mentioned him before. It was his wife was the bridesmaid at the wedding of Jerry and Martha Hoadley. I remember him very well. I remember Lieutenant Dick Welch, who incidentally after World War II became a president of Boeing Aircraft, one of their divisions. I can remember Lieutenant Alvin Dean, Lieutenant Carlton O'Brien, who was a forward observer and who was the lieutenant I was with in combat, and Lieutenant Draheim was in our battery. I remember him very well. And Lieutenant Cameron, all great guys, all great guys. I would never could have asked for better officers. Sometimes, there are some officers who were unforgiving, I'll put it that way, strict, unforgiving, and sometimes difficult to get along with. I didn't have that experience in my battery.
What do you remember about packing up and leaving?
I remember that when the word came, everybody was in a state of shock, because by that time we had become so used to being in Camp Campbell and then Camp Barclay, we were unprepared for it. It came at a time when we were so comfortable being there at Barclay. We said, "Oh my gosh, now it's happened. We're going to go." So after the initial shock wore off, we got back to reality and said, "Well, this is what we were being trained for." And then the excitement began all over again about that we were going overseas. Of course, we weren't told where we were going, but we were told that the schedule, and that we were going to the port of embarkation in New York, which was Camp Shanks. So obviously we knew we were going to go to Europe, but where, no one had an idea. And of course, the trip after we had put all our equipment on the flat cars, and then we boarded the train, which took forever to get to New York, because we were put on sidings sometimes for a day at a time to let other traffic get through. And I think the route that we took from Barclay to New York took us up through Missouri, and then Illinois, and then back down to Kentucky, and then back up to Pennsylvania, and then back down to Maryland. We were all over the place. They were just using the available trackage to get us to there. It was a long trip, and we finally arrived at Camp Shanks, which is just north of New York City. At that point, we were given, we were there for a couple of days, and then they said, "Okay, we're giving you a 24-hour pass." And boy, that was great, because that was right near my hometown. I was permitted to call my mother and father, and they made the trip from Long Island to Dumont, New Jersey, which is where I mentioned so that I was born. Dumont, New Jersey was quite near Camp Shanks. So I had the opportunity of traveling only maybe a half an hour from Camp Shanks by train down to my relative's home in Dumont, and I met my mother and father, and oh, it was a happy reunion, and I met my uncles and aunts, and oh, it was a grand time. And after the evening was over, we had to go back to Camp Shanks, and I said, "I'll see you tomorrow." And the next morning when we got up, they said, "Silence is the word, we're leaving." So I never saw them again. We boarded the train in Camp Shanks and went right down to New York City, and boarded our vessel to go overseas, and that was it.
What boat did you go overseas, and tell me about the overseas
The
trip?
Tasker H. Bliss, which was a troop ship. It was a fairly large troop ship, and of course we went in a convoy. And there was a certain amount of anxiety amongst everybody of being in but you saw all of the protection around you, the naval destroyers, and there were many other boats in this convoy. There must have been 100 boats. A lot of them were taking equipment, some other troop ships besides ours. I think ours was probably the largest. I'm sure it was. It was the largest ship in the convoy. And the conditions, of course, were crowded. I remember that being below deck, and then the calls every morning about sweepers, man your brooms. Everybody who was on call had to get up there with their brooms and sweep down the decks. And then we had to eat our meals in shifts. Of course, there was too many. But the trip was a fairly peaceful one, because the ocean at that time was calm, and so there was very few fellows that got seasick. There were some, of course, but the ship was, I suppose, as comfortable as it could be with everybody there. We were kind of crowded into the cots, which were maybe three levels going up, and we were scheduled to go. They finally said we were going to land at Cherbourg in France, and about a day or so out from Cherbourg, they announced that the route had been changed, and we were going to go to Bristol in England. and that's where we landed, and we were then overseas, and we were in England.
What were some encounters you had with some British people?
Not many with the British people, only because that we were really confined to the camp most of the time. We were permitted to go to the surrounding communities on weekends and sometimes in the evenings. Would require us getting onto the buses and going down. But my encounters with the British people were mostly friendly, and I thought to myself, it must be very hard for them to have been in the war as long as they were, and here all of a sudden, here come the Yanks, and they're flooding the British Isles no matter where you turn, and we were on their homeland, but they were as gracious as you could ever expect anybody to be. I'm sure there were some instances, and some of the fellows were rude in some ways, and that caused a little bit of antagonism on the part of the British towards them. But in general, I found them to be very hospitable. I had one 3-day pass to go to London before we went over to France, and I had a very nice time there. I was invited to go to a home by a couple of girls, believe it or not. So I spent a night and the following day in their home, and was treated with royalty. I mean, they were very, very gracious. So I had a very favorable impression of that.
Tell me about the trip across the Channel.
Trip across the Channel was really uneventful because it was after D-Day. We were all anxious, as to what was going to happen. But it was a quick trip. We took the trains from our camp down to Southampton, and we boarded the various the convoy ships across the Channel, and we landed there. And my recollections of that were, not very sharp or anything, because it was a relatively uneventful trip across there and landing there.
What exactly were you trained to do?
My job, I was what you call a forward observer in the artillery. It was not the most pleasant or the best of jobs by far. Specifically, what I was trained to do is I was the eyes and the ears of the artillery. I had to be up in the front with the infantry, and to find targets to shoot at, and radio back. And the guns, or the artillery guns, were usually several miles behind the front lines, and radio back, and when I had a target, give them some directions as to what I wanted to do, and to have them shoot out an artillery round, and for me to spot that. And then when it was spotted, I would have to adjust it onto the target by telling them that that shot or that round was over the target, or in front of the target, or left or right, and to adjust it on. So from the time we went into combat, I rarely saw the rest of the fellows in my outfit. I only saw my immediate section, because we were always with the infantry up in the front, sometimes even out in front of the infantry. And one of the reasons that the job was hazardous was because the enemy, as we were too, we were always looking for forward observers. They were always looking for forward observers, because if they could spot us and they could knock us out, they knocked out the whole artillery, because there was nobody we were the eyes. We were the eyes for them.
So what was your first, where was your first battle?
Well, I'll tell you about my first day in combat. We were down in a little French village called Luneville, and the night before we went into combat, the captain marched us all down to this little, Captain Wiley, he marched us down to this little French bar, took the whole battery in there, had the bartender line up little shot glasses filled with Calvados, which was Applejack, strong. And everybody had to take one shot of Applejack, the whole body. As soon as one guy finished, the bartender would fill it up for the next guy, So that was our indoctrination, supposedly. The next morning, we were put into the front lines, and Captain Wiley came to me and said, "I want you're coming with me. We're going to go up front and see if we can find some targets." So he and I'm not sure the captain. I think it was Captain Adair from B Battery, and his forward observer, my counterpart in B Battery. We went up to the front lines, and they saw this gentle slope of a hill, and they said, maybe we can get a view of the battlefield from there. We can pick out some targets. So we had 2 jeeps, and we drove up to the top of this hill, and it was a farm, and at the top was a silo, a farmhouse, and a building where obviously the cattle were kept. Of course, there was nothing in there at that time. They had moved everything, or they had slaughtered it. But here we were on the top of this hill, and we took out the binoculars, and sure enough, boy, we could see all kinds of activity going down there, including a whole column of German tanks and infantry. So we were said, boy, there's a target. We'll radio. Oh, excuse me. So you put it back on there. Okay. No, I'm staying. That's right. Okay. We all set?
Okay.
All right, so I'll continue.
Okay.
So we spotted these targets, and we were just getting ready to send it back by the radio to shoot a round out, when a German 88 shell came in and landed about 100 yards behind us. And within a matter of 15 or 20 seconds, another round came in about 100 yards in front of us, which meant they had us bracketed. So the next round was obviously going to come in right where we were. So we all looked at each other, and they said, "They got us bracketed. Scatter." So there was this huge concrete water trough where the horses drank out of. It must have been 15 or 20 feet long, and it was filled with water. And when they said scatter, I had on my long winter overcoat. I dove into this water trough, and the moment I did there, the barrage came down, and it lasted for a good 15 or 20 minutes. And all that time, I was in that water trough, taking quick breaths and submerging myself. And finally, the barrage let up. And when I realized it let up, I said, "I got to get out of here." I jumped out, and I ran like the devil down the backside of the hill. And the other 3 who were up there, 2 of them were in the farmhouse. And they came out and they ran down the hill, and the 4th person was over near the silo someplace, and they ran down the hills. But the 2 jeeps were destroyed, and days later, when we went back there, because we moved forward, the battlefield had moved back, we had pushed the Germans back. I went back up and I looked at that water trough, and there were huge chunks of concrete, big sizes of them, all over taken out. The water, how it never was completely destroyed, I don't know. And I thought to myself, boy, what a way to be indoctrinated into combat. So that was my first combat experience.
What are some other stories from other?
Well, that's funny. That was my first day. The other most dramatic thing that I can remember, or that was very close to me, was, believe it or not, the last day that we were in combat. Again, we were out in the front of my own artillery battalion, And at that time we were down into the foothills of the Alps mountains. It was beautiful scenery, but as a matter of fact, it was like a flat plain, and then all of a sudden, out of the flat plain, the mountains, the Alps mountains, rose up, and a beautiful sight. So we got down there, and we were rather lax and relaxed at that point, because we knew it was going to be a matter of time before the war was going to end. We were supporting the 17th Infantry, and we had an armored column. We started up into the Alps mountains on this mountain road, and on one side of the mountain road, the mountains went up, and on the other side of the road, they dropped off right straight down, and there was a river, the Inn River, which went down to Innsbruck. So you had a very narrow mountain road where we had the armored column going up, and as I said, there was no way to even turn around or anything on it. We got up a few miles into the mountains, and the Germans had felled some trees across the road, so the column had to stop. And it was like an accordion, because you had the first tank up in the front, and then the second tank, and the third, and then you had other kinds of vehicles, and they all kind of moved in close to each other. The Germans were up in the mountains, and they started throwing hand grenades down, like somebody was throwing a baseball at you or something, but they were throwing hand grenades down on the top of the column. So we had to back the column out of the mountains, which we did finally, and we set up a command post in a small chateau at the foothills of the Alps. And the 17th Infantry, they dismounted from their vehicles, and they went by foot back up into the mountains to see if they could wipe out the resistance up there. Meanwhile, we set up a command post in this chateau. I was in a room with Lieutenant Isley. He was an observer then, and myself, and two fellows from my outfit, Corporal Klatt and T5 Robert Schwartz. One was a radio operator, and one was my assistant. We were there for some period of time, and finally Isley said to me, he said, maybe we ought to go by foot up into the mountains and see if we can lend some artillery support to the 17th Infantry. I said, fine. So I slung a radio on my back, and he and I left the house. And the four of us were in a room in the house. We left the house. No more than 10 minutes later, the Germans had pulled up some 88s across the river. We were right on the Inn River there. And they let a barrage loose onto the chateau. And the first rounds went right into that room where we were, and the two fellows we left behind were killed. And it was a dramatic. I thought to myself, it was fate. What made us leave that room at that particular time? If we had been in that room and stayed there, we would have been killed too. But we had left there, and to this day, I think of the tragedy of that. And that was our last day, incidentally, that we were in combat. The last day. The following day, they had wiped out the resistance, and the war ended the day after that. And I still to this day think about those two fellas. They're buried over in Saint-Avold Cemetery in France. What a tragedy. Just the last day of the war. So I remember that. Of course, in between that, I remember the things about Herlisheim, which were so bad. That was probably the bloodiest battle that we had. And several fellows in my area were wounded. Matter of fact, I was even hit by shrapnel, but it wasn't bad enough that for me to require, any major medical attention. Put a couple of band-aids or something on my hand and my legs where I was hit. And but of course I remember that. And I can think of today also in the beginning, a few days after our we went into combat seeing the first dead soldiers, both Germans and Americans, and you know, frightening experience. You say to myself, "Gee, that could be me," but we had some humorous incidents too. I can remember going into a small German walled city. That was typical of that area then, because going back to medieval times, the people used to house themselves into little clusters and put a wall around it, and that was their wall city. And then in the daytimes they would go out and they would work on their farms out in the field, and in the nighttime they come back into their city. So you found a lot of those there. We had been approached, and I can't tell you the name of the town because I can't think of the name of it right now. But in any event, it was in Germany, just inside of Germany, and we came to this little walled city, and the Germans were inside, and we had a little skirmish with them, and they finally withdrew from the city. What they had done is they let us in. So we went into that city at dusk in the evening. And after we had settled into the city, they ultimately came back and they surrounded the thing. And we fought our way out of that. But while we were there that first night, I had my section in a room in a house that we had picked out, and the houses were very close together with small alleyways in between, probably no wider than where two people could fit between one house and to the next house. Our command post was probably 100 yards down the road from where we were, and we settled down in there and we thought, well, maybe we can get a nice sleep here. And we were on a ground floor room, and we were sleeping in on the windows. I was sleeping right under a window, and right next to the alley. During the night, some of the Germans, they came sneaking into the village, and they had what they call a Panzerfaust, which is like a bazooka. And they knew where our command post was for some reason, and they let loose these Panzerfausts, which is huge explosions. Well, when they went off, everybody woke up. They were trying to level the command post, and what happened was that the German squad that had let this loose, they immediately retreated, and they were running down the alley right next to where the window was, where I was. I had one fellow in my section from Kankakee, Illinois. His name was Ray Meyer. He was an amateur boxer, and he had 2 cauliflower ears. I don't know whatever happened to Ray. We never found him after the war ended. But he was a little punch drunk, you know, and we always kind of kidded him a little bit. Well, when he woke up and he heard this roar go off, his instincts were, get out of the house. He ran over to the window, threw open the window, jumped out the window, and it had been raining, incidentally. And just as he jumped out the window, the last of these Germans were coming down the alley, and he collided with this fellow, and both of them went tumbling down into this wet alleyway. And of course, when he jumped out the window, we were all awake at that time too, so we ran over to the window, and we looked out and we saw this scene down there. We didn't know who was more frightened, the German soldier or Ray, but the German soldier got up and he ran like the devil down to where his buddies were. And to this day, another fellow and myself, we still remember sitting there and looking at my mind, and he's down there on his back and he's looking up and he's saying, "What happened? What happened?" So we still talk about Ray Meyer and what happened, and that scene. It was you know, it was a combat experience, but it was also something that was humorous.
What are some things about Herrlisheim? What are some other?
Well, Herrlisheim, of course, was a bloody battle. The infantry went into the village several times, and we retreated several times because it was so bloody. And the things that you can think about was that was one of the few times that I went back to my outfit, because the front lines were so indefinite there. You didn't know where a front line was from moment to moment to moment. And we were firing even those big guns. We were firing what they call direct fire at that point in time. In other words, when I explained to you before that my job as a forward observer, I was up in the front and I would radio back, and then they would shoot out. That's called indirect fire, meaning that they could not see the targets. I was guiding them onto the targets. Direct fire is where you can see the target because it's close enough. And we were using those big guns to fire direct fire because you could. There was no need to see. We were that close together all the time, and it was like constant combat. There was no let up. There was no relaxation. It just seemed that you couldn't hardly sleep because there was something going on all the time, and any sleep we got was just little scattered bits, and we lost. And the artillery doesn't lose personnel the way the infantry does, because the infantry is so exposed out there in the front, and that's why when you look at the list of the killed in action, you'll see the infantry outfits were loaded with names, and the artillery they were much fewer. But that was one point in time where we did lose a lot of fellows to being wounded, some killed, but a lot wounded, and it was as I said, it wasn't really hand-to-hand combat, but it was almost close enough to be that. But it was the thing that impressed me the most, the incessant combat going on. There were no breaks at all in the action. Most of the time, maybe you get a day or 2 days when things would be fairly calm, and before something else would break out again. That wasn't true at Hurley-Shot. It was just bloody all the time, and I think that's why we remember it so vividly.
What are some different things between the German and the French people? How are they receiving you? Similarly, or in different ways?
That's an interesting question, because we found, I think most of us found that the French people were less receptive to us than the German people, who were our enemies, and that was really highlighted after the war ended. Most of the German people have been, were tired of the war. I'm sure the French people were too. But the German people were much more, well, of course, the German people were afraid after the war had ended that the Russians were going to come in and be in their zone or their territory. And they were pleading with us all the time, are the American troops going to be here, or are the Russians going to come in? Well, we couldn't tell them that because we didn't know ourselves. But in spite of that, I found them to be much more receptive to having us there, in spite of the fact that they were our enemy. The French people, I've always felt, did not appreciate what we did for them. We came over and we saved them. And it was like, well, the war's over, go home, get out of here, get out of our territory. I felt very strongly that way. They were almost to the extent of being rude, I would say. But again, I'm sure maybe some other people had different reactions to those kind of things. But I enjoyed the German people. I thought that they were so glad that the war was over, and in spite of the fact that their homeland was destroyed, they knew that we were really friends with it. The American people are always friendly anyhow, I think.
Did you take part in any of the liberations of the concentration camps?
Yes, I was. Landsberg was one. Again, I was always up with the forward elements, and particularly at that stage of our combat, which was in the final days when we were racing across the Rhineland, and those were, of course, were the days when we came to the concentration camps. And I was usually up front. I can remember coming to Landsberg and seeing the pitiful, what were left of the people who were in the concentration camp, and things that they were trying. I guess they were trying to burn down. I don't know whether it was them or whether the Germans in retreat were burning everything down. But most of the prisoners that I encountered, it was like they were. It was almost gruesome. You could tell, they had malnutrition. A lot of them were incoherent. They're kind of wandering around, and your first thoughts were, let's get these people and get them fed and get them cleaned up and to help them any way we could. Unfortunately, we were in such a rush at that particular point in our time, because we were just gobbling up the territory mile by mile, and so my own personal experiences were limited to coming into the camp. We tried to assure them that we were there, they were free, and we could look at them, but we spent no more than maybe an hour or two there before we had to go on our way. And then to follow up the troops that were coming in would be the ones to take care of them and take care of what was happening at the camp. We had to get on to the next tile and to make sure that we didn't stop.
What do you remember about the fast movement with Patton?
I'm sorry?
The fast movement that you went, you moved really fast because you're with Patton.
That's right, exactly.
And tell me about that.
Well, I can remember, of course, you probably have heard that we were the mystery division. We had to erase all of our insignias and everything. And when we started, we went up to Trier. We left the 7th Army down south, and we went up to Trier. And I can remember that periods of time that we just started and we kept moving. It was almost like a car that you were accelerating to me. You're starting off and you start slow, and all of a sudden you get it up to a certain speed, and that's what you keep going at. That's almost the way I remembered the thrust that we had from Trier, which was really like Luxembourg, over to the Rhine River. And we started kind of slowly, we were groping our way, but the resistance was so minor at that point in time. And once we broke through, we just took off, and we drove right straight through to the Rhine River. And I would say that the most we encountered during that period was small arms fire from the enemy, as opposed to like any artillery or major bombing. And of course, the Air Force, the German Air Force, was literally destroyed at that point in time. So that it was almost like non-existent. So of course, when we got over to the Rhine River, we had to go down. We had several heavy skirmishes there. One of which was where Sergeant Carter, who won the medal of, was awarded the Medal of Honor. That was one of the places he was too. I remember some of those towns. There were some in the cities, in the major cities. There was still kind of major resistance. The Germans were holed up, so to speak, there, and it was some jobs to root out the resistance there and then get on with it. And of course, as soon as we got across the river, then we started racing. And again, there was resistance all the way, but it wasn't enough to stop us at any period of time. We just kept going and going. We finally, in the forward elements, which I was with, We came down at one place after we had crossed the Danube. I can remember, and I couldn't believe it, there was a field, a whole field full of thousands and thousands and thousands of German soldiers who were surrendering. And they had stacked their rifles up, and they were just standing there, and they had some fires going, and they were standing around the fires, and they probably outnumbered us about 20 to 1. And I suppose if they picked up their rifles and decided to fight, but they didn't. But I can remember that, and I'm looking at some of the others and saying, boy, this is unbelievable. They were surrendering, and they were surrendering to us. But we didn't have any time even to stop at that. We had to keep going. Follow-up troops came in, and I guess they took them back to the prison camps, wherever they were going to take them.
What do you remember about the day? You told us before what happened the day before the war ended. What do you remember actually the day that the war ended?
The day the war ended, which should have been a day of elation, and in some ways it was a day of sadness for me, because I was still in a little bit of a shock about losing these two fellows who were in my section and who I was very close to. After the war was over, as a matter of fact, the one fellow, Lenny Platt, he lived in New York City, and as soon as I was discharged, when I came home, I went up to see his father was dead, but his mother was living, and he had a brother. And I went up to their place, and I visited with him, and I told him the circumstances, that what had happened to him, and how sorry it was. And of course, they were glad to see me, but still very. His mother, I think, was quite bitter about what had happened, and more so because of when it happened. And I felt very, very badly. But just like anything else is, when you lose somebody, as a friend or whatever, you have to get on with things, and so ultimately you are. But I'll always remember that as long as I live. It was as one of the tragic things that I felt happened to me in my life.
What do you remember at the day when you came home to the States?
Well, before I got home, most of us, they deactivated the 12th Armored Division at a certain point in time over there, and we were all reassigned to others. I was reassigned to the 1st Armored Division, and from there I went to Le Havre, and I ended up in the 84th Infantry Division, just to come across the ocean and be discharged. But I remember that coming across in the convoy. We had another convoy, and a lot of the ships in those days were called victory ships, so they were built in the wartime. And a lot of them, they were pretty good ships, but they were built in a hurry. We always wondered how safe they were. We started out, and I came home in January of 1946. So we started out from Le Havre with a convoy of maybe about 12 ships. Most of them were troop ships coming back, and I happened to be on the convoy commander's ship. I can think of it if I remember, but I can't think of the name of the ship. But in any event, about a day out, we ran into a North Atlantic storm, and one by one, the other ships in the convoy turned around and went back. But our ship, this convoy commander, we call him Suicide Williams. That was the name of the captain. He was going to come through this. He was going to keep going. Well, it was day after day of this ship riding up on a crest of a wave, and then come slamming down, and the plates on the sides of the boat would be rattling, and the screws which turned the boat in the back were out of the water, and we're going bam down and up to the next wave and down, bam. And this went on for 2 days. And I thought to myself, I got through all the combat, and now I'm going to die over the Atlantic Ocean. I think about 3/4 of the guys on the boat were seasick. I didn't get seasick because I was on the water a great deal of my life, early years. But we finally got through through this, and we came into New York Harbor, which was that was probably one of the highlights of my life. Seeing the Statue of Liberty coming in, and knowing I was home. It was like, I can't believe it. I'm finally here. And when we got off the ship, we immediately were put on a train and we were sent to Fort Dixon, New Jersey. And as soon as I got there, I called home and told my mother and father I was home, and because my mother was crying her eyes out. And my father, who worked in New York City in the bank, said to me, when are you actually getting out? And I said, I don't know, but I'll call you again. And the next day I called him and told him I was leaving the following day. I would be home. So he asked me to come into his office in New York, at his place, and so he could go home with me. And I remember getting into it was on Broadway in New York, Lower Broadway, down on Wall Street, and going down there and going into his bank and walking in and seeing my father. He was a manager of a department there, and him standing up and tears in his eyes and coming over and hugging me, and I had tears in my eyes. And he had, well, he must have had about 30 or 40 people working with him, and they were all crying to see me back home, because I knew a lot of them, and it was you know, an emotional time. So we went home. He commuted from New York City to my home, which was in Seacliff, which was about an hour or so's ride on the train. So we got on the train and we went home, and we walked down the street, and my mother was waiting on the porch of the house, and she was crying. So we cried all over again. And as I said, it was really a very emotional time in my life. Just that coming home that way.
Did you ever go back to Europe after the war?
Did I ever go back where?
To Europe?
Yes, I've been back 3 times. I didn't go back with any group. I went with my wife, and first time I went back, the two of us went. My brother-in-law, for a number of years, he was the president of Avis, the rent-a-car outfit, and he recently retired. But in his years when he was going, he was president of Avis International. He had his headquarters in London. So we went to London, and then from London he arranged to have us a car, of course, and we went over. We did England. I went back to Windmill Hill, which is where we were during the war. I had some job finding that. There's a famous place in England called Windmill Hill, but it's not the Windmill Hill where we stayed and we were encamped there. I did find that, and I went back, and it's a British Armored Corps training ground now. But then we took the plane and we went over to Paris, and we had picked up another car there, and then we toured Europe, but I had specifically in mind to kind of retrace some of the places I was. And we went back to these places, but at that time, I'm talking now, I think it was 1970, around in that time. And already we're talking about 25 years since the war ended. And of course it wasn't the same. You didn't, as you remembered it in your combat time. So I went back there then, and then about 4 years later, I went back and took my youngest son with us, and we did some of that stuff all over again, and retraced some of the stuff. But I did go to some of these places, but I didn't recognize anything.
What has the 12th Armor Division Association meant to you after the war?
Interesting question, because for many years I didn't know it was in existence. What happened was they had their first reunion in New York City, which was right near me. But at that time, I was at the University of Wichita in Kansas, so they tried to find me and they couldn't because I was gone. And I didn't really hear from anybody until years later. One of my closest buddies called me and said, we've been trying to find you, because when I finally came back from graduating from college, I settled in a different town from where I was. I settled in the community where I am now. But they found me finally, and that wasn't until the early 70s. So there was that huge span in the 12th Armored Division when they were meeting every year, they were having their reunions, and I was unaware of it. Of course, when I finally found them, I went to my first reunion in Philadelphia, and I believe it was around 1970 something, the early 70s someplace. I think it was 75 if I'm not mistaken, but don't quote me. And since that time, I became very active in the association. I've been served on all kinds of committees. I'm very interested in it. I've been on the auditing committee, the nominating committee. I've been on the executive council, and of course now I've been the unit rep for 12 years of the 495th. And so I've been on the Blue Ribbon Committee, the chairman of the Blue Ribbon Committee. I've been on the Woman of the Year Committee. So I've kind of actively participated in things, and now I'm, I guess like most fellows, we're weary a little bit if you've been working so hard for years for the association, and realizing that the number of years are limited, and what's the future of the association going to be, and I'm very concerned about that. But it's played a very active part of my life. Just being part of this and remembering what's going on and the friendships that I've made.
Do you have any other stories or anything else you want to tell me that I haven't passed?
About what?
Just about anything that I haven't covered.
I don't think so at this time. However, I will be glad to fly down to Abilene and renew the tape if you want me to do at any particular time.
Okay.
But
we'd love to have you in Abilene, definitely. Come down and see the campus. So.
Yes, I'm planning to get there sometime. Maybe even next year,
okay.
When we have our reunion in Houston.
Yes.
I had several of my children. As a matter of fact, I had 3 of my children. We have 5 children. 3 of my children lived in Houston at the same time for a short period, so that they're familiar with Houston themselves, and I am too. So I'll be renewing some people that I know in Houston, and then when we're down there, I might drive up to Abilene if I can, because I'm anxious to see what you have there and what the story is. Mm-hmm. And if we do, I'll be sure to look you up.
You have to.
Okay.
Kyle, do you have any questions? Okay. That's it.
Yes.
And we always interview people if they want to more than once, because there's always other questions. And if I would do it again tomorrow when I was a little more awake, and somebody else even came in and interviewed me.
Well, I had more war experiences,
I'm sure.
but I'm wary.